Now we're good. Everybody hear me okay? Susan, you hear me? Can you hear me okay? I guess she's looking at me, but there we go. All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to an early special call meeting. We only have one thing on the agenda. So do we need to call roll or anything? Yes. Okay, so why don't we do that, start off.
Here.
Engel? Here. Flood?
Here.
Bolt?
Here.
Rutherford?
Here.
Seymour?
Here.
Salter?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, we just have one item on the agenda, and that's discussion regarding Santa Fe Depot, including but not limited to projects, goals, long-term needs, and funding options. And our city manager, Andreas, will address us.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. How are you this morning?
Great.
I know it is early. We have coffee and lots of sugary treats. This is not going to be a boring presentation. I'm so glad that you devoted the time this morning to come here for the special session. You may remember that just a short 3 weeks ago, I reported to you the progress the city had made on the half-cent sales tax for our capital improvement program, which was approved by our citizens in 2018. And yes, we are on track with the sales tax receipts. We are also making excellent progress, having already completed several of the projects and have begun work on several more. Now, at that time, you may remember that I also said that we had two specific projects that we needed to pay some special attention to, and one of those being the Santa Fe Depot. Since the original list of capital improvement projects and associated cost estimates had been prepared, new information has come to light, particularly on the Santa Fe Depot. And today's objective of the work session is to provide you with an overview of the Santa Fe Depot in general, as well as additional details that have come to light related to the rehabilitation needs of the depot itself. And I understand that our projector is out, which is why you all have hard copies of the slides, but for the public who does not have that access, we also have the slides. So every so often I will be looking at the monitor to make sure that I'm on the correct slide as I will be talking about this. The work session is broken out as follows. I will provide you with a brief overview of the depot's history and its footprint. Together we will then step through the various deeds and leases and more deeds that have shaped the ownership of the building and the premises, as well as the depot's management. Throughout the life of the depot, it has seen several different uses that have shaped the interior of the structure. I will report to you some of the findings of the recent building envelope study, which brought to light more than the naked eye would have been able to discern. The study also serves as the basis for the various rehabilitation needs, laying out restoration recommendations, reuse of existing materials whenever possible, and potential sequencing of improvements. I also thought it would be helpful to see what is happening with rail depots in peer cities. Thus, I will quickly summarize the research that had been conducted. This research also uncovered rehabilitation costs per square foot and various funding sources that were used for repair and rehabilitation elsewhere. Seeing what has happened at other depots may even provide us with ideas of how we develop a future vision for our treasured landmark. And we will also quickly talk about potential partners and resource agencies to whom we can turn for both ideas and lessons learned, because there is no need to make mistakes that other people have already made for us. And of course, we will have ample time for questions and answers before we close today's work session. Bear with me as I turn pages. As you know, the city of Shawnee's early economic success and growth was truly fueled by the railroad industry. At the turn of the last century, the city was home to 3 railroads: the Choctaw Railroad, which ultimately was bought up by the Rock Island, the Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad, also known as the Katy, and of course the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, which we commonly refer to as the Santa Fe Railroad. Each one of those constructed stations in the city, and the most striking of which is, of course, our Santa Fe Depot, located at 614 East Main Street. For an original cost of $65,000, this facility was initially constructed by the Santa Fe Railroad alongside its tracks in 1903. And once completed in 1904, it operated as a train depot for the next 70 years. Built in a Romanesque style, the depot's sandstone architecture is very unique to Oklahoma. Notable features, and you may all know about this, are of course the clay tile roof, the high vaulted ceilings in the side of the building, and the beautiful recessed archways above the doors and windows. In 1974, the depot was added to the National Register of Historic Places. So we do have a true historic landmark in our town. The structure consists of a first floor that takes up the entire building footprint, and that measures nearly 3,300 square feet. It is inclusive of 2 separate waiting rooms, restrooms, baggage room, and a ticketing area. A step-down express room is located on the north side of the building, and there is also a partial basement which functions as the mechanical room. All that is built over an unexcavated crawl space. And on the next slide, you will see the original layout of the depot. We will quickly step through it, starting on the north end of the building and working our way to the south. The north on that slide, which is shown on the right side, is of course the express room, which was originally not accessible from the main area. However, in its current layout, a door has been added between the baggage and the express room, so it is accessible from the main area. The baggage room was also altered from the original layout. It now contains an extra partition behind which HVAC components are located. The main and the ladies' waiting rooms have retained their original layout, whereas another doorway was added to have access to the ticketing office without having to step outside of the building. Speaking to the ownership of the depot and the land on which it sits. As with any research into land ownership and title sequence, words matter greatly. So bear with me as I read some of this straight from my piece of paper to make sure that I get it absolutely right. In April 1977, the city turns over buildings located at 400 East Highland to Santa Fe Railroad in exchange for the acquisition of the Santa Fe Depot. The city specifically wanted to preserve the depot as a national landmark. The language in the agreement with the railroad reads as follows: City desires to acquire said stone building and preserve it as a national landmark. Based on this agreement, the city did not take possession of the land on which the depot sits. Instead, the city agreed to enter into an attached lease agreement with the railroad, which specifically stipulated the city may occupy the premises so long as the building is used by the city for the purpose intended, referring to it as a national landmark, and the building is maintained to the satisfaction of Santa Fe. The lease with the railroad also specifically states that upon any such discontinuance of the use of the building by the city will, at their expense, remove the building. So in short, in April 1977, the city acquired the Santa Fe Depot, but only leased the premises on which the depot is located. Then, in October of 1978, the city in turn leases the building and premises to the Pottawatomie County Historical Society. Now, in that lease agreement, the following language is of particular relevance to the city. The lessee herein, referring to the Pottawatomie County Historical Society, desires to lease said building and land whereon said building is located for the purposes of establishing a historical museum. The lease agreement also stipulates it is agreed that the leased premises herein shall be used exclusively for historical purposes. It is further agreed that the lessee, referring to the Pottawatomie County Historical Society, shall at all times keep the building and leased premises in good repair, and the lessee, again referring to the Pottawatomie County Historical Society, shall pay all utility bills thereon. Now jumping to September 1985, Santa Fe Railroad accepted a letter declaring no objection, a letter from the city declaring no objection to the railroad's sale of the depot land. The city then enters into an agreement with Mr. Buford White to purchase the depot land once the railroad sale is done. In February of 1986, we did find the deed. The Santa Fe Railroad sells the depot land as well as the additional land north of the depot to Mr. Buford White, and the associated quitclaim deed is recorded by the Pottawatomie County Clerk on May 15, 1986. In September of that same year, Mr. White then sells the depot land to the city, and the special warranty deed is recorded by the Pottawatomie County Clerk on October 14, 1986. So from that point in time forward, the city not only owned the Santa Fe Depot, but also the land on which the depot is located. Moving to January 1997 and again July of 1998, in each instance, the city approved an updated lease agreement with the Pottawatomie County Historical Society for the Santa Fe Depot building and premises. And in this most recent lease agreement, which was presented to the City Commission on July 20, 1988, the following language is of interest. The lessee herein, referring to the Pottawatomie County's Historical Society, hereby agrees to pay the lessor, referring to the city, the sum of $1 as rental for each year. The lease agreement also states it is agreed that the leased premises herein shall be exclusively used for historical purposes. It is further agreed that the City of Shawnee shall keep the building and leased premises in good repair, and the lessor, again referring to the city, shall pay all utility and telephone bills thereon. Since that time, no additional updates have been made to the July 1998 lease between the city and the Pottawatomie County Historical Society. So we made sure we had a clear chain of title all the way to the present date, and fully understood the deed restrictions that were placed on each one of those transactions. Thank you for bearing with me through the legalese here. On the next slide is shown the parcels that specifically lay out the depot land. Shown inside the oval mark is the parcel of the land on which the depot resides. And of course, the Santa Fe Depot land is easily recognized, the Santa Fe Depot itself is easily recognizable by the red clay roof. Moving to the next slide, we will be talking about the building use. As mentioned earlier, the construction of the Santa Fe Depot began in 1903, and it was ultimately completed in 1904. Through the first 70 years, until 1973, the Santa Fe Depot was operating as a train depot. After the building was acquired by the city in 1977, the Pottawatomie County Historical Society was approached to see if the society had any interest in housing their exhibits in the building. The society began leasing the depot and land premises, and in early 1982, the Pottawatomie County Historical Society opened the depot in part as a railroad museum as well as a historical museum for Pottawatomie County, showcasing both exhibits, artifacts, and information for both. Also shown on the right side of the slide is a June 20 newspaper article from our very own Shawnee News Star, which discussed the progress made on the Society's new building. Since the early part of 2021, early part of this year, the Pottawatomie County Historical Society has operated its museum out of the Paul and Ann Milburn Center, so no longer out of the Santa Fe Depot. At this time, the Santa Fe Depot is not open to the public, and it is no longer used as a museum. Moving to the next slide. In preparation for the discussion of the building study and some of the rehabilitation needs, I wanted to show this aerial image of the depot. I think it provides a really great overview, and from this viewpoint, you can easily see the various portions of the roof. the regularly gabled sections above the expressway on the right side of the image, the baggage, the main waiting areas, and the restrooms. And then, of course, the very distinct round roofs above both the rotunda of the ladies' waiting room and the circular tower itself, which is so recognizable for this historic landmark. And then we also have a flat roof above the breezeway, which is shown on the very left side of the image. What I would also like to call your attention to is the stone parapets, which complete the roof on almost all sections, with the exception of the baggage room. And that will come into play here later on as we're talking about some of the concerns and issues with the building. Moving to the next slide. At the regular meeting of the City Commission on October 2020, so just last year, a little over a year ago, a contract with GH2 Preservation Architects from Tulsa, Oklahoma was awarded. GH2 was retained to investigate the roof structure and building envelope specifically, report their findings, and then recommend a design for the roof replacement for the depot. GH2 specializes in preservation of historical buildings and was chosen for their relevant experience and expertise with properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places. As I shared earlier, the Santa Fe Depot is a historic building and it was listed on the National Register. I do have the ID number for you if you would like to look it up. When the building was first listed in 1974, its condition was described as excellent. Since that time, some cosmetic treatments and smaller repairs have been made, which included cleanup and repainting in 1986, along with vegetation and landscaping. In 1986 and 1987, an accessible ramp was installed on the west side of the building, and in addition, the state of Oklahoma grant allowed for the funding of the new roof section. No major updates or improvements have been made to the building since. However, there was a significant amount of money spent on sidewalk and streetscaping, which I know that everybody just absolutely loves because the paver street is just awesome. It's very unique. Moving to the next slide. GH2 Preservation Architects, of course, has since produced the report that we have asked for, and it documents the current state of the interior walls, the underside of the roof, the exterior roof and parapets, the exterior facade of our historic Santa Fe Depot. And the report also provides an assessment of the extent of the existing water infiltration and potential causes thereof. The water damage to the underside of the existing roof is apparent, and the spalling of the stonework and interior plaster damage is clearly visible. Shown on this particular slide and the following two slides are several images contained in this GH2 report. The kind of damage shown here is found in multiple locations across the depot, so these are just exemplary images for damage that is in multiple places. In clockwise rotation, starting from the top left image, we have broken roof tiles, previous repairs not in line with historic character of the building, issues with the ridge caps, flashing that does not go up high enough on the sidewall and therefore allows for water infiltration, open, very open masonry joints, both in the building wall and along the stone parapets, which allow the rainwater to get into the walls and therefore into the building. Moving to the next image, the previous pictures may not have seemed as shocking at first blush until GH2 started using additional investigative techniques to look below the surface. On this particular slide, we have an image of the north side of the express room with its row of windows. Directly underneath are infrared images that clearly show the location of water inside that wall, particularly near the middle window. It is indicated by the significantly cooler temperatures in this infrared image, which show up as a dark color. Going back to the exterior wall, you may also be able to make out where the gutter allows the water to just simply run down the wall instead of capturing it and taking it to the downspout. That is shown as a dark discoloration on the building's sandstone. And then if you look really close in several places along the north wall, you can also clearly see that the mortar joints, the masonry joints, are gone, again allowing for water infiltration into the building. Moving to the third set of images, last but certainly not least, we move to the inside of the building where the water damage is clearly visible. The depot looks relatively unscathed from the outside, particularly to the naked eye, but once you move into the building, you can see just how much damage the water infiltration has done. That effect is clearly visible on its effects on the interior wall plaster, the wood rot, and again through thermal imagery. I also included a picture that was not related to the roof system or the water infiltration, and that is the center image towards the bottom of that slide. It shows the damage to the paver walkway that is located along the east side of the building. You may remember that the streetscaping and sidewalk work was done on the west side of the building. Here we're looking at the east side, and there are significant issues with the paver walkways. And again, those are all images that are included in the GH2 report. As you could see from those images in these previous slides, that the Santa Fe Depot truly has a significant repair and rehabilitation need. At a minimum, $600,000 are needed to make the building watertight. Addressing the issue with the roofing system and building envelope would entail reusing the existing undamaged clay tiles. It would include specialty manufacturing of replacement tiles, the repair and repointing of all of the masonry joints, both on the parapets and the exterior walls, the repair and extension of the flashing and guttering, which in quite a few places is too short and therefore allows the water to get behind it. And it also includes making sure that the scuppers, the downspouts, and the subsurface lines are all functioning the way they were intended. The repair of the building envelope would then have to include the restoration of the windows and doors because those have become points of water infiltration as well. So at a minimum, and only, I say that, only with favorable construction bids, $600,000 is needed to make the building watertight. A further $141,000 would provide for some site repairs to said paver area, and an additional $608,000 would be needed for interior restoration to undo the plaster damage and wood rot and other things that happened because of the water infiltration into the building. All of that brings the total depot restoration to a cost just under $1.4 million based on GH2's estimate. And of course, as you can imagine with any cost estimate, there is a caveat. I would really like to emphasize that the estimated cost does not yet include testing for asbestos-containing materials, lead-containing paint, abatement of both of those. It also does not include a construction management for a project of such historic significance that is a must, and then it does not include construction and material contingency costs. So again, only with favorable bids would we stay at that $600,000 mark for construction and material. And as you may have noticed, the pandemic has really taxed our supply chain, so there may be some further cost increases because of supply chain issues as well. So in light of, moving to the next slide, in light of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad Company who's built our depot, they have constructed rail depots like this across the nation in many other states, so it is not just us. To learn from these peer cities, I researched 24 additional Santa Fe depots specifically in locations across the nation, and I gathered information on current ownership, specific use and function of the building, and whenever available, I also compiled building and site rehabilitation costs and any associated funding sources thereof. In addition to those 24 Santa Fe depots, I also found 3 railroad depots, one of each built by the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, the Rock Island Railroad, and the Great Northern Railroad, respectively, all located within Oklahoma or close by. I figured we'll look to as many depots, rail depots, as we can. Of these 27 depots reviewed, Oklahoma was represented with 8 locations, closely followed by Texas with 5. Most interesting among the research findings is the multitude of uses beyond transit or rail service and museums. Use as a transit or rail hub or as a museum accounted for 45% of all uses reported. Together with community and event space or leasable office space, these top 4 made up 3/4 of all the uses reported across the depots. It is important to note that half of the depots had at least 2 or more functions. Also interesting was finding that half of the rail depots are directly owned by municipalities, 16 were actually in private hands, and almost as many were then managed and owned by nonprofit organizations. The cost of renovations, of course, differed significantly from a very, very low 20,000 to a high of 15 million, to an average spectrum of 1.9 million, which did not include the outliers at the very, very end, either end of the spectrum. Once normalized to square foot, the cost ranged from just over $260 per square foot to $420 per square foot, averaging about $330 per square foot for a historic building. So we're not talking residential or even commercial construction. Historic buildings cost more per square foot. But again, you can imagine that depends highly on the state of disrepair of the structure. I found many, many great articles, websites, reports, even nominations for awards. It was very informative to see what other regions were doing with their rail depots and how they went about rehabilitating those structures. Moving to funding sources. Based on those research locations, the largest portion of funding for rail depot repair and rehabilitation came from federal grants, which was in most cases routed through the respective state departments of transportation. There, the majority of the funding came out of the Federal Highway Administration and its Transportation Alternatives Funding Program. And having been associated with transportation planning for 2 decades, I can tell you that program changes its name about every 5 years or so. So it has multiple names when you look at different projects, but it is always about transportational alternatives that are not related to motorized roadways. Some of the federal funding, but to a much smaller degree, came from the Federal Transit Administration, which does contribute money to some infrastructure and facility upgrades. However, the funding can only be used if there is a direct nexus to transit or rail passenger use of the infrastructure. The next funding piece was usually provided by state funding, and it was pivotal in several cases. It was either used as a match to the federal funding or as a supplement to local funding. And dependent on the use or function of the depot, and dependent on the grant application, that state money can either have a transportation focus as a historical transportation building, or it can have a historic preservation focus. So there are multiple state agencies that can be applied to for grant funding. And of course, a significant portion of the repair and rehabilitation cost was actually covered by funding that was raised locally, both by the cities who own the depots and to a smaller degree through community fundraising efforts. Moving to a future vision for our depot. Thus far, we've largely focused on repair and rehabilitation of the depot, which would of course begin with making the building watertight so as to aid in its preservation and stop further damage from happening. But after looking at the peer cities and what they have done, we also have a much better idea of the spectrum of possibilities which lie ahead for the Santa Fe Depot. We have not yet discussed what the community's vision is for this historic building and it being a national landmark. In what function and capacity would the Santa Fe Depot benefit the community, the city, its citizens and residents, its visitors? What would benefit our Main Street and downtown businesses? And what ideas do nearby property owners have that could really help revitalize that area of town? These questions should be brought to the respective constituents. That is not something that we alone at the city can answer. And as stakeholders, we really need to engage with them for a much more in-depth discussion. So vision is something that we will definitely have to tackle for the Santa Fe Depot in light of the heavy lift that would be required for repair and rehabilitation. And I'm hoping to provide just a spot of light here because looking at partnerships, there is truly no need for the city to work on the depot in isolation, nor do we have to reinvent the wheel. We will definitely look to our local partners. We will look to our community. But in addition, we should get connected to those entities and partner agencies who in part may assist us with funding, like the Oklahoma Department of Transportation or the Oklahoma Historic Society, which specifically functions as the state's Historic Preservation Office. It would also be most helpful to gather practical lessons learned and technically and financially feasible ideas that will help us move forward from museum and tourism advocacy and interest groups, of which there are just a few listed on your slide. There are a lot of groups out there who've already done this, and it would work really well for us to learn from their mistakes and experiences rather than trying to do this on our own. And then moving to the next slide and the next portion of our work session. I understand that this was a lot of information to take in a relatively short amount of time. My hope is that you found it informative and useful and that it will really help shape future discussions about the Santa Fe Depot. With all of that said, I would really like to open up for questions and answers that the Commission has in regard to the Santa Fe Depot and what was presented today.
Very good. Who's got questions?
I have a few, might sound kind of all over the place. Could you say what year our roof was, when were the clay tiles put on last? Do you know?
Those are the original clay tiles that came with the building.
They are? Because the clay tiles have a 75-year lifespan, so in our current...
We're like 50 years past that then.
Yeah, so in our current bid, our bid is just to repair some of the existing, not to replace all of them.
That is correct. When GH2 architects came out, preservation architects came out to look at the building, they had a look at the clay tile, and the current bid estimates that about 70% of the clay tiles are reusable.
And I'm familiar with this company. I've used them personally, and they do a great job. So I trust their assessment. Under those clay tiles, there's an underlayment. Back in 1903, it was felt, and that deteriorates. And that's in good shape. They're okay with
It has to be replaced.
So they're gonna take all the tiles off, put new felt, and then put the 70% of the tiles back
Correct.
on? Okay.
If we're going to all the trouble to replace a third of the tiles and knowing the life expectancy of said tiles, would it not be a forward-thinking move to go ahead and replace all of them with a substance that might get us another 70 years versus the first big hailstorm or windstorm, we're right back in the same shape?
That would be a wise consideration, but it would add greatly to the price tag of the depot.
So speaking from personal experience, the removal of the clay tiles is a difficult process to maintain their structural integrity. So removing them, it's almost as expensive labor-wise to take those off and put them back on than just to buy new clay tiles. And like cheaper clay tiles, maybe not Ludovici or whatever on there from 1903, that have a 50-year warranty, it might actually be not as expensive to put. I know that sounds crazy, but it's so hard to not break them. You take them off, put them back on, and the labor is really expensive. The labor is the most expensive part probably in this project. But that's something that
We had asked them to provide us a cost estimate of making the building watertight. Considering life cycle cost, such as future deterioration of those tiles that would be reused, that was not considered at the time, but that is definitely something that should be checked into before we pull the trigger.
because another thing you mentioned was that cost doesn't include construction management. Does that mean, are you talking about the labor of the overseeing, not the physical labor, but their 20% or whatever that they would normally add?
I could not state the exact percentage. Oftentimes it does work out to a percentage. With a project this specific, we do not have the in-house expertise to watch the contractor and make sure that they do everything the way they're supposed to. So having a construction management company specifically experienced with historical buildings and particularly clay tile roofs would work in our best interest, because they can come out and they can watch the contractor do what the contractor needs to do and hold them accountable to the original design and the standards of construction. Whereas we do not currently have somebody specialized enough on staff within the city to be able to do that. So construction management is a percentage of the overall construction cost, which was not yet figured into that $600,000 for the roof structure and building envelope.
So that being said, rather than, what was it, 1.4, we're probably bumping up near 2 million here pretty quick, aren't we?
I would venture to say that we would be very close to that average which we extracted from those 27 other depots. Yeah. Not that all of them had cost estimates associated, but what information, financial information I could compile averaged out to 1.9 million. Yeah, I think that is a much closer realistic number than the 1.4 million.
Yep. What else you got?
I mean, that's $500 a square foot.
Mm-hmm.
This may seem out of left field, but with the new transportation, federal stuff coming down the pipeline, I know this is kind of a shot in the dark that they've discussed Amtrak expansion, which would open us up for some of the transportation grants. And if the citizens or whoever, determine that's something they'd like to see, however that process comes about of us figuring out the new, use of the building, is there a way for us to look for preservation options that would make us an attractive bidder for an Amtrak stop? I know that's, I mean, see
From,
what I'm getting at?
from having been involved in Federal Transit Administration grants, they are specifically focused on ridership. The infrastructure piece, such as the transfer station or, rail station, comes in after the fact. That is required, that is required as part of the service provision. But it's not stipulated that you have to have something as grand as a Santa Fe Depot. So for an application for FTA funding, they truly look to the model of how many trips are you serving with the service you want to put into place. And having a depot fully restored is beautiful, but does not grant you those extra points in the application process. In regard to transportation funding, if I may add to your earlier part of the question, there is, of course, the new infrastructure bill, and there will be additional transportation alternatives funding that is injected into the program. So the pot of money that has previously been used for Santa Fe rail depots or other rail depots is indeed preserved and enhanced with the most recent infrastructure law that was passed.
What else you guys got? I'll think about there.
So, moving forward, the first thing obviously is getting it dry, getting the roof repaired, roof structure, all of those things. That's approximately 600,000, 700,000, or a little more. So, during that process, we need to find the funding to do that. We have, what's budgeted, 300, 400?
We had 400 in the house and sales tax capital improvement program set aside for or dedicated to the Santa Fe Depot. Some of that money was used for the GH2 study because the study included the design of the roof replacement. So we no longer have the full 400,000.
Do you know about how much we have left?
I would have to go back and give you that exact number. I've been looking at so many numbers, I'm afraid I may give you the wrong one, but I will definitely follow up.
But the study, I think, was, 140 or something like that? Is that
I
what you guys
remember.
remember?
I was going to say that number, I don't know if that's accurate, but that's
No,
what
I've
was in my
slept a
mind
time or
also.
two since
Was
then, but-
140.
That's the number that's
For
always
some
stuck
odd
in my
reason,
mind.
I remember 160,000, so
Yeah. So probably we're sitting at about $250,000, somewhere in that range,
correct.
ballpark, without committing to an exact dollar amount, but,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
while we're working on that piece, trying to get that funded or get that done, then we need to decide future use. If there's some type of use that maintains its historical site and could also possibly be revenue generating for something. If we had that information before we finish the interior, so it could be adapted to some of those things.
But those two things could work in parallel and at the
Absolutely.
same time.
But yeah, getting it dried is a priority, then we can do the inside.
So we need to find an additional 400,000 to get it dry. Because there's nothing else we can really do in the short term to mitigate future damage.
Because of the multitude of issues, even if we just put the missing clay tiles or broken clay tiles back and fix the roof cap, we still have the guttering issues. We have the missing masonry joints, so the water will continue to come in. So unfortunately, the roofing system, the building envelope has to be addressed in its totality.
And then I've done a little bit of preliminary investigation, a few conversations on historic tax credits. Have we looked at that, or?
I have not seen, but again, I'm relying on, a certain level of information. I have not seen where historic, where tax credits were used. However, that is definitely something, as we get into direct contact with some of the depots that recently completed their rehabilitation, we can ask them those very detailed questions.
Because we have a pretty good resource on historic tax credits here in the community, and I'd recommend we engage, and just as we try to learn and look.
Yep, absolutely.
On some of the grant applications, have you looked into those much? And would we have to determine use before applying to get the money to fix the roof? Do we have to have kind of a...
The two federal grant funding sources, Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administration. Federal Transit Administration has the definite nexus. Unless it is used for transit or passenger rail, that money is not accessible. Federal Highway, the Transportation Alternatives Program, has a specific clause in its language for historic transportation buildings, and that does not necessarily stipulate future use. Just the fact that it was a Santa Fe rail depot opens up that federal funding program for us.
Are there additional dollars that, this is another brainstorm, but entering into a Main Street program could open up additional money for the depot since it's on Main Street? Or is that?
That could certainly be considered. It was my understanding that there have been Main Street programs before within the city. And I'm taking notes to make sure that I get those questions that were not fully answered this morning. I researched those answers for you.
How much of the cost, just call it $2 million for discussion, how much of that cost is because it's on the National Historical Registry? Like, how much is our cost enhanced to do it up to those standards versus if it weren't?
Commissioner Matthews, that is a question beyond my knowledge.
Perfect, that's fine. I'm kind of brainstorming and thinking, like,
So to privately fundraise some of that future use would probably need to be decided or come into play before we can start asking for money,
I would think. People probably want to know what they're writing a check for.
other than to preserve the building.
Yeah. So how soon can we start that process?
Deciding future
So-
use?
Yes, and, I mean, we've got to start, I mean, both of those things have to be done right away, like you said, so.
As soon as the commission desires.
there you go.
Yesterday.
Yesterday.
we started yesterday?
There you go, Dana.
A future use that would
Possibility of us to have it
maintain
It would be huge.
the ability that we have now. You know, it's such a photographic place and historical
Absolutely.
place, and the museum's right behind it and all of that.
Yep.
But so, and which is great. But what can we do with that facility that would be generating revenue?
And you may remember from, and I can go back, it was topic number 6, where it shows all of the different uses that the other depots that we researched had.
Right.
And also remember that half of the depots actually had 2 or more uses, so we don't necessarily have to find just one. The building would offer, because of its layout, would offer the opportunity to have more than one use in it.
Right. I remember you said most of them had 2 uses, or at least a very high percentage of them did.
Correct.
But I'd like to see us get started on this pretty quickly, determining the
So
use
is
of
the Hot County
funds.
Historical Society, I guess they still hold the lease on it.
That is correct.
So what, I mean, we should be asking them what they're wanting to use it for.
We absolutely should involve them in the constituent discussions,
So I guess
absolutely.
The question being long-term, what are
Mhm.
their intentions?
Yeah, like
If
their
we,
plan.
you know, on our end, we need to get the envelope of the building in the drive and then figure out what we're gonna do with it. Because the longer it sits there like it is, the
Yep.
more it's gonna cost us long-term to fix it.
Correct.
Yep, that number's only gonna go up, isn't it?
And I think, you know, some of the community will get on board to help with the amount it's gonna take to fix that. But, yeah, at some point, you know, do you keep throwing money at it, or is money better spent somewhere else? Who does it benefit?
Yep.
And that is part of that larger vision discussion.
Mhm.
This may be a little irrelevant, but I just want to make sure I understand, and I don't expect you to have the answer. But I heard you say 1998, when we updated the last lease update, we transferred responsibility from the lessee to the lessor for the condition of the building and all utilities. And my second question regarding that I don't expect you to necessarily have an answer, but I'd like for us to look into is, do we know why? Like,
That switch from lessee, referring to the Potawatomi County Historical Society, to lessor, the city, occurred in January of 1997.
Okay.
1998 added the telephone bill to the utilities. I do not know, from what I've researched for other depots, in some cases, museum operations do not bring enough funding to cover all of the operating expenses, and that may have also played a part in the switch in our lease agreement. I know that has happened elsewhere around the country with other depots, and that may have played a part here as well.
Besides the transportation and historical grant opportunities, is there a way that we can tie this into a Parks and Rec? Is there a way that we can get some funding, maybe deeming that area some sort of a park as well? That may be a stupid question.
I do believe that as part of the visioning, you could go multiple ways. It could be seen as a visitor for economic development purposes. It could be part of a larger discussion of that quadrant of Main Street. It could be for leased office spaces. It could be for community event space. There are so many different opportunities that would then allow access to additional and different funding sources. But at this time, because we do not have that vision fleshed out, the only two pots of money we can tap into are the transportation and the historic preservation. So additional funding opportunities may become available dependent on the vision that is ultimately determined for that building.
So, I mean, it sounds to me more and more then we need to really get working on what that vision is. And obviously here in December, you're not going to get anything started now, but I mean, after right after the first of the year, I think we ought to get right on that.
I've got that written down with a exclamation mark.
The reason I bring that up is just because there's the grounds with the old house and I mean, if there was a way for us to collectively envelop to access some more. Because I see great potential for how it could be turned into this active town center in downtown and really be our, but it's so expensive too.
There's probably a little more room down there this week to expand than there was last week.
Yes.
Yeah, sadly.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, that just kind of solidifies our point that we need to get off our butts and start doing something, because more and more buildings are going to end up, unfortunately, like the Dr. Pepper building, as they deteriorate and they're taken over by, you know, different situations and things. And so, as I think really quickly, there needs to be a meeting set up with the Historical Society so that we can ask them what your plans are, how can we, you know, move forward and
I guess the thing that bothers me more than anything is, you know, we're gonna spend $2 million on it, which we want to preserve it, no doubt, but is that the smartest thing to do? You know, I mean, is $2 million better well spent to develop an exit off of I-40 for something that has a huge tax base? You know, we're looking at revenue versus what that's gonna produce. I mean, yeah, sure, it'd be nice to have in a perfect world, but is that the correct way to spend $2 million?
Commissioner Seahorn, the collective we staff can dig a little deeper into some of the revenue generating models that have been successfully implemented at other rail depots. Not all are used for transportation purposes or for museum purposes. Quite a few of those have other purposes, and they do generate revenue. And we can dig deeper and bring that information back as well as we're talking about the visioning, because I do believe that the revenue generation is a very important part, because the building will continue to need updates, repairs. It will be an ongoing effort.
This won't be the last time this will be talked about,
I
that's
am
for sure.
certain.
Yeah.
Well, if it's something kind of like, just to reiterate what Cammie was saying earlier about the whole area being brought up as a whole, kind of like Scissortail in Oklahoma City, it's all around their depot, and that area is continuing to grow. And if that was part of a bigger plan, then you know, you could see that being kind of the linchpin for that expansion and that big project of downtown area. And I think that,
But it's close to the interstate.
sir,
I said, but it's close to the interstate.
Yeah, there's.
it is.
If this was sitting on the interstate, it'd be a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
It'd already be restored.
That area was really run down before they did that. Nobody went there, even though it was close to the interstate.
Yes.
Nobody went to their depot.
But the traffic is driven from the interstate. I mean, if you look at any community, it grows around the interstate, the highway system.
And I
If
think
that was-
Look at property values on I-40 versus property street values on Main Street.
they're increasing, and
But-
we've got to find a way to be competitive as a small town. in the
Oh,
deep-
and I agree. I mean, but, you know, an acre on Interstate 40 is $1 million. What's an acre downtown?
But if we make it nicer,
Yeah, I
If
think
we-
if the same intention was spent on 177, which is just a jump away from, there, as has been on I-40 for the last several years, then it wouldn't be as, I know getting off the interstate in the city, jumping off in 177, it takes about the same time to get there versus the lights and traffic and things. I think it just, if we just focus on one section of our city and say, well, this is where the path of least resistance, because everybody's driving by at 80,
We
but
spent more on Main Street from city money the last 50 years than the rest of the town. As far as city money, I mean, because most of the stuff that we've seen around Interstate 40 and what is all private development. The city hadn't built streets down there, you made the developer build streets. The city hadn't brought sewer out there, you made the developer bring sewer out. So, the physical money we spent on Main Street for the return on it, as far as I look at it, is pretty low, because we don't have, a Home Depot. We build office buildings down there, they're not being built, or doctors build, they're not bringing tax base in because they don't charge sales tax. Retail is what drives the business.
So when I look for successful examples, when staff looks for successful examples elsewhere, we will look at interstate access, revenue generation, how those two play together, because what we really want to find is a successful example elsewhere that can be replicated. Putting infrastructure, there is always that fine line between investing up front and then reaping the benefit after, versus waiting for somebody to discover us and then benefiting from it. We will research examples and inject those into the visioning process to make sure that we find something that is technically and financially feasible for the city. At this point in time, the depot costs us a lot of money just sitting there. And we're not,
So when realistically can we expect that we would get that started and have that report back from you? I know it probably won't be this month, I understand that.
It probably, you are correct, Mr. Mayor. We are currently interviewing for our community development director, and hope to have this person on board as quickly as possible, because it would be nice to have them in the visioning process from the very get-go.
Absolutely.
But even if we don't have that staff person yet, we will start at the beginning of next year.
Okay, so probably at least by the second meeting in January, we probably should hear something from you there.
And give us a little longer, because a proper visioning process takes a lot of time and a lot of
No,
conversation.
I figured that part would, but I mean, as far as, are you gonna report back to us on like what other towns have done as far as revenue generation and that sort of thing? Show us successful models of that. The visiting process I know is gonna take longer, but I just wanted to know when we'd be kicking this off.
We can certainly bring you successful models from elsewhere, and also a plan for rolling out the visioning process within the city.
Okay, so by the second meeting in January, we should
Yep.
see that, just so people know when to expect to see something. Very good, thank you. What other questions you guys got? Manny, you've been quiet. You got anything?
Well,
Just wanna make sure
I
you
have two
get your
parallel
opportunity.
thoughts. The first one, we need to waterproof the building. We've been talking about the roof, but the walls are atrocious, if you haven't seen the walls. I was really dismayed when I got to see inside and really look. The walls are worse than the mausoleum. Those that have been out in the mausoleum since we took it over. And I'm really interested in further use. Been mentioned about fundraising. I think we have enough pride in Shawnee that we can get the money if we can give the public a good example of further use.
Yep, I agree.
And those are going to have to run parallel, but the building will continue to deteriorate if we don't do something about the roof. And that's $600,000-700,000
Yeah.
problem right there. And I'm just really appalled that it's gotten into this shape over the years.
Yeah, it's sad to see, because you and I did the tour together. And I mean, that was good to go in there and be able to see it firsthand where it's kind of cleaned out. And I appreciate staff taking time to take us through there, because that was very helpful to see that firsthand. So,
Just one comment quickly. 600,000 or 700,000, we're looking to waterproof it. And the overall price tag is huge, but I think we know we've got to do this. I think it's important to look at net cost too, because our only other alternative, and this is not what I'm proposing at all, but our only other alternative is to tear it down.
yeah,
And that's not free either.
no.
I mean, we'd spend several $100,000 tearing it down and removing the debris. So the net cost to waterproof it and put us in a place where we can then look for the restoration isn't much more than we'd have to spend if we decided we were going to do nothing. In my mind, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure we haven't researched that yet, because that's not what any of us want to do, but the reality is demo's not free if we were to decide to go that route.
We will definitely have to do an asbestos and lead testing, because the abatement cost would have to be considered as part of the demolition if it went that way.
Right.
To make the building watertight, asbestos and lead, it will be interesting to see that net cost, and we will work on that.
Anybody got anything else?
I know I've talked a lot during this.
That's okay. That's what we're here for.
I see the restoration of the depot as an improvement. Yes, maybe initially it wouldn't be making sales tax revenue like a Lowe's or something, obviously, but I see that as a great improvement of the quality of life for our town, and this unique kind of shining jewel that no one else has. And if we are able to get the money to, because the grounds already look great down there, and there's so much progress that they've made. I think if we can kind of brainstorm and wrap our minds around it, this not just being a money in, money out, fix the roof, then how does it generate money for us, but this in conjunction with the other plans that we have to develop our city, because we are desperately in need of some quality of life, uniqueness things to attract and maintain talent. I guess that's my comment. I see the depot as this opportunity for us to really enhance our city, and a beautification project that would be and kind of have a lot of intrinsic value. So I think we could get creative in the ways that we think of uses and where we get the money from and get on it quickly.
Like anything else? So just to recap, could you kind of just lay out a timeline for us over the next couple months and how you see this playing out?
So internally, we will start working on plan to accommodate the visioning process. We will report out on successful models elsewhere, uses, funding, and revenue generation, and then also on this internal plan that we will be rolling out at the second meeting of the commission in January. We will look into abatement and lead testing, the cost thereof, and then what that would cost in terms of abatement if the building was to be demoed, so we have a better understanding of all of the facets, all of the alternatives that are available. Not that we would want to pursue those. And then we will continue to look for funding sources and make appropriate connections with the State Department of Transportation and Historic Preservation Office.
Okay, and you'll just keep updating us. We'll make sure everybody knows
Absolutely.
what's going on as this progresses. And I want to just say again, because we did talk about demolition, that's not what any of us are talking about. We just have to do that as a business case is all that is.
We
Just
are-
looking at the dollars and cents.
We are stewards of city,
Right.
of our citizens'
Right.
money, and we want to use it in the best way we can. So we need to look at all alternatives, all options, all successful models to really utilize it as best as possible.
Right. We're ready. Has anybody got anything else? You guys all good? Have you got anything else for us?
Thank you so much for coming in so early this
No,
morning.
we're glad to do it. With that, I guess we are adjourned, and we'll see everybody this evening. Thank you for coming.